Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 5. Six years later. Lord Clarges, I am writing to you now in the full understanding that you have formed a new life since last we met. Though I am loath to intrude upon it, I am compelled to inform you that His Grace the Duke, your own grandfather, has fallen to ill health, and desires your company, as there are issues of estate yet unresolved between you. Please make haste and return to Hertford House at your earliest convenience for his sake. Sincerely, Will Graham. Hertford House had not changed any more in 6 years than it had in the time that he'd been away at war, Hannibal found. Not on the outside, at least, save for the cobbled road that now fed in from those that led to the capital. The passing of 6 years' time had dulled his anger somewhat, but he still felt uneasy returning. He had not quit this place in any good form, and was not proud of how he had behaved since, but he would face what needed to be faced in order to bring peace to his grandfather. Hannibal sighed, dismounting to walk his horse up the lane towards the house, idly noting the manicured lawn and the thriving growth of saplings planted within the past few years. So, some changes then. Will would have changed too, no doubt. Hannibal had heard a stray story of his absent spouse from time to time, whispers in ballrooms where he danced with women who were not his own, tittering and laughing about the unacceptable spouse left pining away at Hertford House, or, more scandalously, dealt with the same as his first wife had been. Less often, he'd heard tales from his cousin Anthony. He had written Hannibal first shortly after he'd gone to ask him why he was not in residence at Hertford House, and again some time later to tell him that both the Duke and Will refused to step foot off the grounds, his grandfather due to his failing health, and Will due to the very public disgrace brought on him by Hannibal taking a mistress the moment he landed in the capital. Anthony, never one to mince words, had managed to prick his conscience without offending him. A rare talent, indeed, considering his traitorous acts, and wrote only now on the occasion that it happened to strike him. His own letter of their grandfather's declining health had reached Hannibal a scant few days after Will's had, prompting him to return to the ducal seat at long last. Life as the Duke's heir apparent was comfortable, to say the least. Hannibal lived in luxury in the townhouse during the season, where he excelled in his medical duties to his fellow elites. He rotated among his other estates to ensure they were running properly, and summered at another one of the Lecter estates where his mistress was currently installed, thick with their next child. He had no desire to lose the inheritance that afforded them their lifestyle, and that was compounded by his refusal to allow that Omega the joy of seeing him stripped of everything. He only hoped he could prevail upon his grandfather to legitimize his bastard son, should the next child be born male, because there was certainly no chance of a child with Will Graham, and he wished his grandfather would see reason. "My Lord Clarges," Hawke said when he arrived. The usual army of servants turned out to greet him. He was older and grayer, but still stiff with his own dignity, beaming at the man who had been like his own son. "Welcome home at last." "Hawkes," he said, nodding slightly, glancing around for his spouse. "How is grandfather?" "Ailing, my lord," Hawkes said, concern thickening his voice. "He is very distraught by the circumstances. He wishes that you could find a place here." "Ah, but this is not my place, is it, thanks to that damnable Omega?" Hannibal said, a scowl flickering over his features. He handed the stallion off to a footman who took it away. "No matter. I've come at grandfather's request to do as he bids me. What's to be done after is entirely up to me." Hawkes quailed at that one, murmuring, "Yes, my lord." "Take me to him, then." "Ah, he is sleeping just now, my lord," Hawkes said, hastily indicating that the door should be opened to admit Hannibal. "The medication he takes for his arthritis tires him." "And the Omega?" Hannibal asked, voice taut, as he stepped inside and looked around. There were all manner of changes inside the house proper, updates that had been long overdue. He imagined Will had a grand time prancing about ordering staff off their feet to cater to his whims. After all, Hertford House had been handed to it on a silver platter, and all it had needed to do for it was play the victim. There was no doubt in Hannibal's mind that if he had not been summoned first, he'd have been barred from the house altogether for the sake of its pride. "Mr. Graham is overseeing some business, my lord," his Hawk said, voice warming considerably. Hannibal laughed, thinking Hawks was making a joke. The butler offered an uncomfortable smile at that, changing the subject by asking, "Should you like to refresh yourself, my lord? I have it on good authority that Mrs. Pymmes has made some pastries just for you." "Ah, trying to fatten me already?" Hannibal asked, willing to be put in good humor, even if his damned spouse wasn't bright enough to realize he should be here to greet him for the sake of appearances. "Yes, that will do just fine. I'm going to have a bath. Send Berger up when the coach arrives." "Yes, my lord," Hawk said, watching him scale the stairs with athletic grace. The changes extended to the upper levels, Hannibal saw. New rugs and runners, new furnishings, new upholstery on heirloom pieces. There was a soft touch to it that suggested the Omega had instigated such changes. Hannibal sourly wondered at their debt now that it had been unleashed to spend to its heart's content in his absence. Perhaps 6 years had been a bit mulish on his part. He'd be lucky if there were 2 pennies to rub together. He did realize that though he saw the influence of Will Graham in the house, he did not find his scent. There was a distinct lack of that sweet smell, in fact, enough so that he let himself through the shared washroom of their conjoined suites to open the door to Will's room. It was there, but faint, like a memory from years before, a cobweb of fragrance clinging here and there. It was strongest at his bed, an indistinct perfume lingering that was hard to trace. Curious, Hannibal moved to the vanity, an item that had served duchess after duchess over the course of its lifetime. He expected baubles and pearls, boxes filled with jewelry bought on impulse and quickly forgotten. He found instead a single lacquer jewelry box with a handful of modest, jeweled pins, each one accompanied by a note of birthday congratulations from the Duke, and nothing else. A silver hairbrush and comb lay neatly to one side. Other than that, it was quite empty, save for several mysterious glass vials of liquid and the blush-pink brooch that Will had worn at their ill-fated supper. "Grandfather must have put his foot down on that subject," Hannibal murmured, moving to the dressing-room. Instead of the overblown wardrobe he expected, Hannibal found a somber sum of clothing suitable for funerals in their lack of color and lack of embellishment. Hannibal himself was no fop, but even his clothing had more life to it. "I hate to greet you with correction, my lord, but you are in the wrong suite." Hannibal turned, armed with a frown, his hands clasped behind him as he faced Will Graham after a 6-year absence. He had not spent much time with Will during his failed homecoming 6 years ago, but even so short an exposure hammered home the realization that Will Graham had changed considerably since. He was taller, still trim even in his layers of disguising clothing, watching Hannibal with unsettling blue eyes that neither flinched nor acquiesced. His dark curls were somewhat tamer, shorter than they had been, and his face had hollowed slightly, his square jaw a perfect foil for the excess of his delicate, full mouth. He'd lied and called this creature plain once upon a time, not nearly pretty enough to get his way. Hannibal very much doubted now that there was anything in the world Will Graham could ask for and not receive immediately just by fluttering his ridiculously long eyelashes, and no doubt he well knew it. "I am the future Duke," Hannibal reminded him, aware that he was testing the air for Will's scent, still strangely elusive even for so close. "Every room in this house is mine." He clenched his teeth once he'd said it, realizing that it was not true, in the least. Hertford House belonged to Will Graham, no matter who happened to be Duke at the time. Will inclined his head with a slight wry smile at that one, arms crossed over his chest, and pale, small hands tucked out of sight. Hannibal noted with irritation that he wore a neckerchief, thick and properly knotted as per the fashion, but entirely covering his throat. He had no means or reason to protest or complain, but he felt an instinctive frustration rise at the Omega's refusal to be seen. Hannibal had never before met one that did not flaunt its neck like a prize, daring any alpha with strength enough to try laying their mark for all to see. "The ownership of Hertford House notwithstanding, your grandfather has assured me that I have a place here, though I have never claimed it is a permanent one," Will said, moving to his vanity to slide the brush to one side. It was less a tidying than it was an excuse to give Hannibal his back, though that, too, was a provoking sight. His shoulders had stretched along with his height, but his waist had slimmed even more, all traces of baby-round softness finally withered away to leave the clean lines of pure symmetry. Hannibal was profoundly flustered. "I assume you're going to remind me that this house is no longer mine," he asked, recovering enough to deliver the barb with true heat. He saw Will's face reflected in the mirror, his dark brows drawing down and a soft frown curving his full mouth. "I had not heard you'd forfeited your inheritance, Lord Claudius," Will said, his gaze lifting only slightly to reach Hannibal's in the mirror, a fleeting contact lost almost at once. "Your grandfather will be beside himself to hear so." Hannibal stared, his own features schooled to hide the resulting bewilderment of that particular statement. "I am by no means forfeiting my inheritance," Hannibal said, scrutinizing his slender mate despite himself. "I am speaking of the fact that Hertford House belongs to you, little though you deserve it." Will tensed, a subtle shift of muscles along his shoulders, a slight tightening at Hannibal's insulted tone. "Hertford House is the ancestral home of the Lectors," Will softly said, though his voice was stiff and offended. "I have no intention of taking that from you, Lord Claudius, but I will not be berated for something which I have had no hand in." "Hertford House is yours from turrets to foundations less than 3 days after your arrival, and you expect me to believe you had no hand in it? Ha! The very nerve!" Hannibal huffed, shoulders back and chin tilted just slightly, unconsciously highlighting his alpha qualities in instinctive reaction to Will's continuing disinterest. "That is why I am here, to discuss things with grandfather so that we may sort this entire mess. It is nothing you would understand or have any interest in." The silence that followed was thick, and Hannibal fidgeted, uncomfortable and feeling strangely uneasy with their conversation, as if Will had the intelligence to realize what his return actually meant, find a way to pry Hertford House from his grasping, greedy little hands, finger by finger. "I am relieved you read the letter and did not burn it out of hand," Will murmured, tactfully changing the subject, or else losing interest. He moved so that Hannibal could no longer see him in the mirror, but still was faced with his shoulders sweeping into his narrow waist, and the flare of his coat that served to emphasize rather than disguise the slight curve of his hips. "And why would I burn it?" Hannibal asked, annoyed that Will would believe him to be so petty when Omegas were notoriously so. "You had never sent a letter, even once in 6 years. I assumed there was some purpose behind it. Well, you're here at least," Will said, turning to face him, his arms crossed again, defensive postures that only served to irritate Hannibal. While he did not expect a warm welcome, he did expect Will to behave as an Omega, alone with Alpha among Alphas. He did expect the usual sort of trembling, wide-eyed excitement he often elicited from courtesans who remained free and willing. He did expect self-aggrandizing chatter meant to endear, the sly looks and coy smiles of a creature that could not help its own nature. Will just watched him, cautious but unaffected, his solemn blue eyes weighty and far older than his smooth face allowed for, trapping a peculiar melancholy out of place in one so young. "If you would like to change rooms," Will slowly said, a mocking smile curving his pink mouth, his head tilting just slightly to one side, as if Hannibal was a bemusing novelty, "then I will have Jimmy pack my things." Hannibal stiffened with affront, mouth pursed in disapproval of his cheek. In a haughty, hard tone he said, "I came to see if you had gone by now, knowing that I was arriving in order to take my place at last. Imagine my disappointment to find you still here." "Imagine," Will blandly agreed, his white teeth flashing in a wry grin. He said nothing more. Hannibal's frown intensified. "Do you always dress as if about to attend a funeral?" he asked, his amber eyes flicking over Will's clothing. Black coat, black breeches, black knee boots, all dark except for his white shirt and knotted neckerchief. He made Hannibal's own tastefully embroidered coat seem positively peacock-like in comparison. Will's brows rose in mild amusement. Hannibal found it vastly unsettling. "Are you trying to insult me, Hannibal?" he asked, sounding ever so faintly disapproving and amused. The sheer gall. "Or are you frightened I've spent your fortune on clothing and somehow managed to hide it all from you?" Hannibal glowered at him, eyes narrowed. He would have said there was some mistake and Will Graham was a beta, but even so faint his scent was undeniably that of an omega, however little he behaved like one. "Ah, I apologize," Will said, feigning understanding of the cause for Hannibal's sudden stiff affront. "You would prefer I call you Lord Clarges, would you not? Very well, Lord Clarges. I shall wait downstairs until you are satisfied with the contents of my wardrobe, and return to your own suite before I intrude on you in my own again." "You'll do nothing of the sort," Hannibal snapped, flushing in consternation, uncertain how something as diffident in nature and fawningly submissive as an omega had somehow managed to subtly scold him. "I have no interest at all in your wardrobe, damn you!" "Of course, my lord," Will murmured, watching him with amused, mocking blue eyes. "Don't call me that, for the love of the gods!" Hannibal ordered, jerking on his coat to settle it, consumed with the desire to groom himself in the face of Will's obvious yet elusive disapproval. "The servants will have a field day." He realized how silly it sounded the moment it left his mouth, saying something like that to the spouse he'd abandoned 6 years before, and then proceeded to publicly make a fool of in polite society. Frustrated and feeling off-center, Hannibal gruffly told him, "Call me by my given name." He stalked purposefully toward the door of their shared washroom, bristling at the soft utterance that followed him out. "Of course. Hannibal." Will released a deep, relieved breath when Hannibal finally left. He slumped against the door, his hand trembling when he lifted it to brush his curls back from his heated forehead. Seeing Hannibal again after 6 years was like a punch in the gut. Secluded here at Hartford House with only the aging Duke, Anthony, and beta servants for regular company, Will had forgotten what an alpha in his prime could do to him. Rather, what this particular alpha in his prime could do, as he had no such issues with Anthony Dimmond during his visits. But then, he hadn't bonded to Anthony Dimmond as he had to Hannibal, and there wasn't a day that passed that he didn't wish otherwise. Hannibal loomed behind his closed eyes, tall and fit, and watching him with the stoic, effortless beauty of an uncaring god. Just the thought of him keyed Will's nerves tightly. His pulse was racing, his nostrils flaring to gather the heavy scent of him. His heart pounded, and he thanked every god he could recall that the scent-blocking products and repressive tonics he took were able to hide the extent of Hannibal's effect on him. He could only imagine how the haughty Lord Clarges would react had he any inkling of how Will's instincts responded to his nearness. "He won't stay," Will assured himself, moving to sit at the vanity before his weak knees gave out on him. He propped his elbow up and dropped his head into his palm, drawing another breath that was easier than before as Hannibal's scent had faded. "He'll leave. He'll settle things with the Duke, and he'll leave." 6 years ago, he'd been cautiously told by Jimmy that his husband had packed his things and gone. Will had been stricken with guilt, anxiety, and panic, knowing he was the cause of his defection, frantic at the thought that he would be held accountable for breaking the Lecter family's main line with his unsuitable presence. The sudden and absolute loss of the alpha that he had instinctively bonded to had devastating consequences for Will, who was left picking up the scattered, shattered pieces of himself without the ability to put back together again. So he'd adapted, as Omegas were designed to do. He'd adapted to Hannibal's perspective, which Will's gift had made his own. He'd adapted to the alpha desires that he had bonded with in a moment of duress and emotional distress. He'd sent Mina's wardrobe back to their father, refused the tailor's recommendations for soft colors and light fabrics. He'd ordered the bare minimum, opting to live like a renunciate, rejecting anything that his nature found pleasing. His place in and ownership of Hartford House was bought with a lie, and Will was determined that they shouldn't suffer for it. He'd taken charge of the house and estate to spare the Duke, and, after just a few short months of overwatch, the Duke had been content to leave things in his hands. For the past 6 years, Will had lived like a ghost in this house, barely seen, rarely heard, and ruthlessly efficient at making the estate run like clockwork. Now it was all about to end, he knew. Hannibal had returned, and he was no more inclined to accept Will now than he'd been 6 years ago. Nor was the Duke any more inclined to pack Will off back to his father and pretend the whole sordid event had never taken place. "Mr. Graham?" "Yes, Jimmy," he asked, looking up to find his valet peeking in the door at him. By all rights he should be addressed by his title, but Will refused it. His insistence they should call him Will had been met with scandalized refusal, but Mr. Graham did well enough for everyone. "Was that him?" Jimmy mouthed, pointing toward the washroom door. Will cracked a weary smile despite himself and nodded, softly saying, "As agreeable as ever, I'm afraid. He was checking to make sure I hadn't invested his inheritance in my wardrobe." Jimmy pulled a face at that, knowing better than anyone how spare Will was with regards to himself. "Has something happened?" Will asked, "or were you just curious?" "Well, you know me," Jimmy chuckled, waving his hand. "But I'm actually here because Lord du Maurier is asking downstairs for you." "His timing is uncanny," Will said, not surprised in the least. "I doubt Lord Clarges will be glad to see him again." "Thank you, Jimmy. I'll be down directly." Jimmy left with a soft smile and nod, leaving Will alone again. He looked at himself in the mirror, staring at his own blue eyes. A stranger looked back at him, pale and lifeless and plain. Certainly no match for a future duke, as he'd been told countless times over the years by overheard gossip repeated below stairs, carried in by the servants who felt the need to defend him against his justified detractors. Sighing, Will pushed to his feet and left, hoping Hannibal was satisfied by what he had found and would keep to his own suite for the time he was here. Anthony was in the salon, a younger and more amiable companion than Hannibal could hope to be, the resemblance between them less strong now in 6 years of growing. Will had never thought he could forgive Anthony for his part in what had happened, but he had actually found him very agreeable and amusing. The fact that he was an alpha rarely, if ever, came up. Will never felt moved to respond to him thanks to his bond to Hannibal, and Anthony had mentioned on more than one occasion that the suppressants made Will a beta male in all but truth. They had become unlikely friends over the years, the close proximity of the du Maurier holdings allowing for fairly frequent visiting during the off-season, though it only went one direction. "Ah, there you are! I wondered what had happened," Anthony called, turning with a crackling energy, tapping his riding crop against his boot in a rattling rhythm. "You weren't in your office." "I was informed by the servants that Lord Clarges had returned," Will said, noting the surprise on Anthony's face. "You didn't know?" "No, of course not," Anthony said aghast. "I would have gone in the other direction had I. Well, I guess that puts a damper on my plans, then." "What plans?" Will asked, idly straightening a pillow on the settee, where Anthony must have been sitting before he came down. "I thought we'd go for a ride," Anthony said, delighted with himself. "Have cook pack us a lunch and go fishing. You've been cooped up in your office for weeks now. You need a break." Will laughed at that, shaking his head a little. "Actually," Anthony said, casting a searching glance at the salon door, "if we hurry, we could get away before Hannibal knows I'm here." Will opened his mouth to say that he couldn't possibly escape, then thought better of it when he recalled how Hannibal had spoken to him upstairs. He nodded at Anthony and told him, "Yes, let's go. He would prefer me not to be here at any rate. I doubt he would complain over the absence of either of us." Anthony's grin widened, similarity to Hannibal giving Will a pang of discomfort, and he rang vigorously for Hawks, who appeared as if by magic. "Lord du Maurier and I will be going on an outing to the dock, Mr. Hawks," Will said, aware of the butler's disapproving silence directed Anthony's way. "If you could ask Miss Pims to make a basket for us and have my fishing gear packed." "Of course, Mr. Graham," he said, his sonorous voice carrying almost as if he'd hoped Hannibal or the Duke would hear him and come investigate. "My Lord du Maurier, will you stay for dinner?" "Yes," Will said for him, and quirked an eyebrow at Anthony's indignant huff. "If I'm going to get into trouble for this, you're going to get into trouble with me." Anthony's grin returned in full force. "Partners in crime, then. Yes, I'll stay, Hawks. Get a move on, old boy, will you? I want clear of the house before my cousin comes to box my ears. I haven't danced out of his reach for 6 years just to be caught now." The hamper was brought directly, and Will's horse was brought about, saddled and loaded with his gear bound on its rump. He mounted up and sighed as he settled into the saddle, already feeling the tension of Hannibal's arrival loosen inside of him. He had few pleasures that he rarely partook of, and a day at the riverside was one of them. "So, is there some devastating piece of news you wish to throw on me?" Will asked, giving Anthony an assessing look, as they rode at an easy pace toward the estate's mill. "What? Why would you ask that?" Because you rode over today wanting to take me on a picnic, Will said, laughing softly. And take me fishing? The last time you did that, you brought me news of Hannibal's daughter having been born. Ah, yes, that, Anthony said, shifting uncomfortably, those high lecter cheekbones stark in the afternoon light, but his mouth more that of a Dimmond. No, nothing so terrible as that. It wasn't terrible, just, Will said, troubled by the memory of it. It was just informative of my place. I'm glad they both did well and thrive. Hannibal's mistresses deserve no blame for my situation. Anthony frowned his direction, mouth pursing. Your sister is becoming quite the talk of the town, he said, the neutral caution of his voice alarming Will more than the content. Which one? I have several sisters, Will said, though he knew which one. His twin, of course. She had married her Lord Rathmore as planned, and in the past 6 years had behaved with the same outrageous arrogance their father had encouraged in her. When Lord Rathmore had taken a mistress, Mina had publicly thrown a fit and tried to have the poor woman's house burned down. There was truly no telling what she'd done now. The last Will had heard, she was threatening divorce and had taken up with an actor, making no move to hide her own affair. Will, honestly, Anthony scolded, shaking his head. I saw her weekend last, and she asked about you. Will felt cold fingers trail down his spine and shivered, wondering if it was his father's doing. Considering she never once tried to contact you in all these years, I was understandably taken aback. She wanted to know what Hannibal's plans were in regards to you. She could have asked him herself, Will said, his voice subdued. I am sure they have seen much of each other these past 6 years. Actually, no, Anthony corrected him, guiding his horse onto the trail, down towards the mill. She was justifiably terrified to go near him, considering the part she played in your marriage. They've not once crossed paths that I'm aware of. She damn near as good at it as I am. I suppose that is for the best, Will said, thinking of what that meeting would have ended up as. I cannot imagine how she would react being called ugly. Ugly? Why would anyone call your sister ugly? I've always been told my resemblance to Mina is frightening to every detail. Hannibal would find her every bit as unappealing as he finds me. Anthony laughed at that, then shot a sideways glance at him, shaking his head. He's alone in that estimation, Will. What few of my fellows who have seen you think you're quite lovely and attractive, with pleasing manners and a faraway sadness that begs relief. You should not associate with such fools. Nor with an Omega, Anthony. Bollocks! Anthony pronounced it, laughing. My prospects are being discussed back home, and a few Omegas number among them, rare as they are. He turned his twinkling gaze on Will and winked at him when he happened to look up, saying, But not a one could compare to you. Will laughed at that, chalking it up to more of Anthony's ridiculous nonsense. They rode a ways down the riverside from the mill to a small fishing dock that the Duke had ordered built for Will as a gift for his birthday, when he found out that Will loved to fish. Will would never cease being grateful to the aging Alpha for all of his many kindnesses, even if most of the affectionate gifts he'd attempted to lavish on Will were refused. Shall we fish first or after? Anthony said, swinging down to take the basket from the back of Will's mount. I'd rather fish for a while, unless you're famished, Will said, deftly dismounting and loosening the straps that held his fishing gear in place. Fishing first, then, Anthony said, already peeling off his boots and stockings while Will put the poles together and strung them with line. Are you worried, now that he's back? No, Will said, focused on finding suitable hooks and sinkers in the modest box Mr. Hawks had given to him to hold his small loose pieces. You know this won't end well, Anthony said, picking his way barefoot to the patient horses to take their gear off. He hissed when his mare shifted, dancing a cursing jig to avoid his bare toes being stepped on. You should have done that before you took your boots off, nature boy. Anthony scowled at Will, but finished anyway, piling the gear up in the shade of a nearby tree, letting the horses wander. You didn't say anything, he finally said, tired of waiting for Will to address his statement. I wasn't aware you'd asked a question, Will pointed out, finishing tying on the hooks, corks, and sinkers. There was a small oilcloth packet of side pork to use as bait tucked into the top of the picnic basket, and he gathered it up, offering one pole to Anthony to take. Hannibal has come to claim his place, Anthony, It's no business of mine how he does so." Anthony took the pole and packet, frowning softly as he watched Will strip off his own boots and stockings. "You could lose everything, Will," he said, sounding genuinely concerned. "If he convinces grandfather to allow an annulment. If he doesn't, Hannibal won't stop trying, not so long as Hertford House belongs to you." "I know that," Will said, his voice quietly carrying over the sound of the river. He stood steadily when he got to his feet, all the long years of his life preparing him to have strength in the face of adversity. It was dangerous, after all, to show any weakness before an alpha, no matter how friendly they might seem. "One way or another, he'll manage to be rid of me. Even after I was told of the Duke's decision, I never imagined my place here would last." Anthony frowned, finding more in that statement than he cared for. "Let's not speak of unpleasant eventualities, Will urged him, summoning a smile that was brittle and worn thin. He headed to the dock and plopped down at the end, dangling his bare feet in the water with a sigh. With no other recourse, Anthony joined him, both of them threading their hooks with bait and leaving more complicated conversations behind them. By the time Hannibal was properly refreshed, stuffed with pastries and tea by his overeager staff, and summarily outfitted in fresh, clean clothing, the Duke was awake and asking to see him. Hannibal steeled himself for what was to come, no doubt some awful row like the one they'd had the last time he was home. He dearly loved his grandfather, but they were two alphas cut from the same stubborn cloth, and that caused no little friction between them. He was not prepared, however, to see his grandfather lying frail in his bed, looking haggard and spare, and much older than he should. "Hannibal," he said, smiling to see his grandson, holding out one trembling hand that Hannibal grasped immediately. "I wasn't sure you would come." "Of course I came, grandfather," he said, wondering where all that strength had gone. Then again, 6 years was nearer a decade than it wasn't, and the Duke had not been young for a very long time. "I had no idea you were so ill. Will should have written me sooner." "He wanted to, but I wouldn't let him," Roland said, squeezing his fingers. "I'd hoped you'd come on your own." Hannibal drew up at that, scalded, slightly ashamed. He thought often of his grandfather once the anger at his machinations had burned out, but his damnable pride had prevented him from reaching out. It had, as always, gotten the better of him in that regard, and this was the price of it. "Hannibal," the Duke said, bringing his thoughts back to the present, "I'm not well at all these days, my boy. I have no time to dance around subjects or spar with you. I want that child, Hannibal. I want a child to carry on the Lecter line." Hannibal stared down at him with wary calculation before telling him, "My mistress is pregnant once more. Should it be a son—" "I'm not legitimizing your bastard," the Duke snapped, the effort forcing a coughing fit that left him breathing hard. When he had recovered somewhat, he went on with less force to say, "You are very much in danger of losing this estate, Hannibal. All I ask is a child." "No. You ask for an alpha son, with the omega you foisted off on me," Hannibal reminded, frowning. "There could be any number of children born before that lauded child. I refuse to be trotted out like a stud to a broodmare." "I've changed my arrangement," the Duke said, pointing weakly towards his roll-top desk. "There, on the blotter." Hannibal retrieved what he was asking for, reading the elegant, precise handwriting with a growing surprise. "Addendum to a previous declaration. Let it be known that the previous declaration of ownership of Hertford House is now amended. As such, Hertford House will no longer belong to Will Graham until the time he bears an alpha son. From this day, it shall be legally of consequence that on the delivery of any sound, living child of Hannibal Lecter by William Graham, ownership of Hertford House will immediately revert to Hannibal Lecter in its entirety, and a legal separation will be filed on his behalf should he so desire. William Graham and his child will remain as guests of Hertford House until the death of Roland Lecter, current Duke of Westvale, after which William Graham's continued occupancy of Hertford House will be strictly by the invitation of Hannibal Lecter." All Hannibal needed to do was get Will pregnant, and Hertford House would be his again. Rather, would be, upon the child's first breath in this world, but nothing more than that. No sharing Will's bed through countless children until meeting that alpha son requirement. No enforced cohabitation in the misplaced hope a bond would form. Just one child. And once he took his place as the Duke, he could see Will thrown out on his ear for his insufferable machinations. There most certainly had to be a catch. "All you require is a single pregnancy?" he asked, sure that his grandfather would never be so incautious where he was concerned. "Even if the child were to be female, or, gods forbid and strike me dead, an Omega?" The Duke nodded unsteadily. Hannibal reread the document, asking as he did so, "And Will would only remain here until the time of your death?" Again the Duke nodded, managing to make it infinitely sorrowful. "I have asked far more of him than I have had rights to," Roland admitted. "He has wasted the best years of his youth shut away in this house with only an old man and your cousin for company. One child is all I ask, and then the both of you can seek whatever design best suits you. But I will have that child, Hannibal, Alpha, Beta, or Omega. There will be a lector of House Reddig extraction, even if your heir is eventually the bastard got of your shoddy widgeon in the capital." Hannibal took a deep breath. "Does Will know you have contrived to turn him out homeless into the streets the very day you die?" "No, he does not know. Nor should you tell him if you have any intentions of making this come about. And I I never indicated that Will would be turned out with nothing. I've made provisions for him in my will that my lawyers and the Dimmins are all very aware of. He will be comfortably settled when my time comes." "Yet with a child, grandfather, there would be no annulment, just this separation you write of," Hannibal said, placing the addendum back where he had found it. "Separation has never seemed to prevent you from finding affection and companionship where you please," the Duke said, wry humor coloring his voice. "Under these circumstances, it will not keep Will from such either. You'll be shed of him, Hannibal, treasure that he is, and I will have the comfort of his company until death finally claims me." "Death will hardly claim you, you stubborn old menace," Hannibal said with a fond smile. "Stop speaking with such certainty." Roland smiled at that, chuckling softly, his breath rattling in his lungs. He sobered after a moment and said, "If you agree, Hannibal, then sign the document." Hannibal frowned, considering all the myriad ways this could backfire on him. As it stood, he would not have control of Hertford House again in his life, not fully. He was a powerful alpha in his prime, and there was a very good chance that he could get Will with child with just one attempt. It seemed little enough of a sacrifice to see his Omegan spouse tossed from Hertford House like the unwanted baggage that he was, with all of society sniggering at his shame. His mind unhelpfully provided him with a clear picture of Will in his suite, leaning against the door with a cat's own lithe grace, his head tilted just slightly so that his curls fell to one side, his sad blue eyes secretive and amused at Hannibal's expense, his full mouth parting on a smile as he asked, "Are you trying to insult me, Hannibal?" His back stiffened in response to that, with instinctive affront and offended dignity. He impatiently returned to the desk and added his signature beneath his grandfather's, tossing the quill down with rather more force than was necessary at the recollection of his mate's cheeky comment. His grandfather watched him with naked disappointment in his amber gaze, and Hannibal wondered suddenly if he should not have agreed, if there was some other option that would bring the light of pride back to the elderly Alpha's eyes. Instead, he fanned the paper in the air and murmured, "I'll have Mr. Stamets file this in the capital with all haste." "Yes," the Duke said, closing his eyes in resignation, sinking back into his pillows. "You do that, Hannibal."